Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're mapping out the dramatic, incredibly high-stakes clash between the British state and organized labor during the late 20th century. We are going to explore a period of history defined by immense industrial power, actual political collapses, and a fundamental reshaping of the entire British economy. Here is how we're going to break this down today. First, the peak of Union power. Then we'll ask, who governs Britain? Followed by Thatcher's preparing for battle, the massive 1984 miners' strike, rewriting the rulebook, and finally, the fall of labor. All right, let's jump right in. Who governs Britain? It's a massive question, right? But it's actually the exact question Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath threw at the public in his fateful 1974 election. It became the defining question of an entire era. And to understand why a sitting prime minister felt forced to ask the public who was literally in charge of the country, well, we have to go back to the beginning of the decade. Section 1. The peak of Union power. To understand Heath's desperation, we have to look at the sheer leverage held by the unions in the early 1970s. Think about this for a second, because 1970s Britain relied so heavily on coal for its energy. The National Union of Miner Workers, the NUM, they weren't just sitting at a table negotiating wages. By simply stopping work, they could literally turn off the lights. The miners could cause power stations to run short of coal and factories to just grind to a halt. They possessed the structural power to challenge the authority of the state itself. Look at how quickly this escalates. The first major turning point hits in January 1972 when a massive miners' strike begins over pay. The miners argued they did dangerous, essential work and just weren't being properly rewarded for it. Just a month later, in February, we see a defining moment, the mass picketing at the Saltley Gate Coke Depot in Birmingham. Thousands of workers joined together to stop the movement of coal, and a Yorkshire activist named Arthur Scargill first became nationally known for organizing this action. By November 1973, with Britain facing both inflation and an oil crisis, the miners escalated again with an overtime ban, threatening the nation's coal supplies all over again. 280,000. That is the staggering number of miners who walked out in that initial 1972 strike. It was an overwhelming force. Faced with this united front, Edward Heath's government eventually caved and granted a large pay rise. It was a crystal clear demonstration that organized labor could win massive, history-making victories against the state. Section 2. Who governs Britain? The pendulum was about to swing wildly as economic crises worsened and the government desperately tried to wrest back control. 3. By January 1974, the crisis had forced Heath to introduce the 3-day week. Just imagine that, commercial electricity use legally limited to just 3 days a week to conserve energy. That impacted every single home, factory, and business nationwide. It was this exact crisis that prompted Heath to call the general election on February 28th, asking that famous question, who governs Britain? Well, the answer the public gave wasn't exactly what he wanted. The Conservatives lost their majority, and Harold Wilson's Labour Party returned to power. The miners' industrial action had fundamentally stripped Heath's government of its authority. But hey, this union power severely damaged Labour governments too. Take the infamous Winter of Discontent in 1978 and 79. Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan tried to control wage rises to curb high inflation. That seriously angered the trade unions, leading to massive walkouts. And this wasn't just miners. We're talking lorry drivers, refuse collectors, hospital workers. It was absolute chaos. Rubbish famously piled up high right in the middle of London's Leicester Square. This widespread disruption completely shattered public confidence in Callaghan's ability to manage industrial relations. 1. The political margins at this point were razor thin, and the government looked completely powerless. In March 1979, Callaghan's government collapsed after losing a vote of no confidence by exactly one single vote in Parliament, 311 to 310. It's crazy to think about, but just one vote changed the entire course of British history. Section 3. Thatcher prepares for battle. That one vote crisis opened the door for a new leader and a completely different approach from the state. So Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party sweep into power in May 1979, and Thatcher came into office with a very firm belief. Trade unions had just become far too powerful, arguing their mass strikes were actively damaging Britain's economy and its democracy. Absolutely determined not to repeat Edward Heath's humiliating 1974 defeat, her government meticulously prepared for a future confrontation with the miners. They did this through 3 strategic steps. They stockpiled national coal, they converted select power stations to run on oil to reduce their dependency on coal, and they massively strengthened the police response to mass picketing. Section 4, the 1984 miners' strike. The decades-long tension finally hits its ultimate climax.
The dispute ignited in March 1984 when the National Coal Board announced plans for widespread pit closures. This conflict became incredibly intense, peaking at the Orgreave coking plants on June 18th, where thousands of striking miners and police officers violently clashed. Now, we really have to look at the infamous Battle of Orgreave impartially. The government presented their actions as a necessary defense of law and order against unlawful mass picketing. But on the other side, the miners fundamentally saw this as a vital, desperate defense of their jobs, their local communities, and working-class dignity against a government that Arthur Scargill argued wanted to destroy the coal industry entirely.
It was a total heavyweight clash between NM President Arthur Scargill and Ian McGregor of the National Coal Board. You had around 140,000 miners walking out at the start. But here's the thing, support was highly fractured. While regions like Yorkshire and South Wales held strong, support was much weaker in places like Nottinghamshire, where many miners actually continued to work. The strike dragged on for almost a year, bitterly dividing communities who had to rely on food parcels and women's support groups just to survive the immense financial and emotional toll. Finally, in March 1985, the miners returned to work without a national agreement. It was a devastating, historic defeat for the NUM. Section 5, rewriting the rulebook. Because alongside that physical confrontation on the picket lines, the government was quietly using the law to shift the balance of power. Throughout the 1980s, Thatcher's government passed a flurry of legislation that systematically stripped union leaders of their ability to exercise the kind of power they wielded back in the 70s. Look at the Employment Acts of 1980 and 82. They limited secondary picketing, so workers couldn't easily strike in sympathy with others, and made unions legally liable to be sued. Then the Trade Union Act of 1984 required secret ballots before any strike action. And the legislation just kept coming in 88 and 90. The state was literally dismantling the structural mechanisms that allowed for mass, spontaneous industrial action piece by piece. Section 6, the fall of labor, which brings us to the final outcome of this decades-long clash. By the end of the 20th century, the combination of these new laws, new police tactics, and massive economic changes meant the state had firmly reasserted its authority. Look at this drop. In 1979, trade union membership in Britain was at a towering 13 million. By the late 1990s, it had plummeted to just 7 million. The defeat of the miners really symbolized a much wider economic transition away from heavy industry and towards a service-based economy. And those tight-knit communities in South Yorkshire, South Wales, and County Durham, they were forever transformed. Organized labor went from literally being able to force the collapse of governments in the 1970s to having far less power to challenge the state by the end of the century. And it leaves us with this fascinating historical reality to ponder. Now that the epic battles of the 70s and 80s are over, and the structural power of organized labor has been permanently reduced, what new forces will emerge to challenge the authority of the state in the future? Who truly has the leverage today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this chronological journey helped illuminate a truly transformative era.